How does domestic violence impact children? That's a question we get asked fairly regularly at our clinic by parents and carers who are caring for children who might have experienced domestic violence in their past. It might be a question you've got. It might be that you yourself have been in a difficult relationship, you know there's been domestic violence there, and you want to know how this has impacted your children. Well, I'm going to talk about that today, including what domestic violence is and the impact it can have on our children and what we can do to help. So what is domestic violence? There's actually a common misconception with domestic violence, particularly when we talk about the impact on children. Many people think that domestic violence happens when a child is hurt, so physically hurt, but domestic violence is actually very different from that. It can be called domestic violence, but can also be called domestic abuse. And it is when two people who are in a relationship are abusive towards each other. And that can include violence, but it doesn't have to include violence. So it doesn't have to include any physical aggression or any physical violence. So a better term for it really is domestic abuse. So domestic abuse is when two people are in a relationship and they do need to be in a relationship. This is why it's called domestic abuse. And that relationship is abusive. Now that can be violence, it can be something like coercion, it can be manipulation, it can be putting someone down, blaming them all the time, making them feel like they're worthless. There's actually many different types of domestic abuse, and that's a whole other video. And a video I think is probably very much needed, so I will create that video, and when I have created it, I'll pop it here. I think it will be there on the YouTube video. But there are many different types of domestic abuse. And you might feel like you've been in a relationship like that, or you might know that your child has experienced domestic abuse in relationships that they've witnessed in the past. So that for our children, the big thing is the witnessing of the domestic abuse. It's not necessarily something that's happening to them, but it's happening within the environment with which they're in, where there is this abusive relationship going on between two people, and that can be a coercive relationship, it can be a manipulative relationship, or it could be a relationship where there is violence that's going on as well. So now we know what that is. What type of impact does that have on our children? Well, it can actually have a significant impact, and there's multiple elements to it. So I'm going to go through those elements as best I can to explain them. So the first one, of course, is the one that probably we would most think about or most readily be on our minds when we talk about domestic abuse. And that is being fearful and worried. So if a child is in that environment, they might be in an environment where people are shouting at each other, they might be hitting each other, they might be putting each other down. It might be one way or two ways. It very much depends on that relationship. But a child is observing that. And that can cause the child to be very fearful for their own safety and fearful for the safety of those around them. That's what we hear very often from our children that have been within these environments, is that they're actually fearful for usually their parent or the person who the abuse is directed towards. And they can become very protective of that person as well. So a big impact is that fear impact. And that fear impact and that worry can actually lead to other things as well. So what we know is that when our bodies are fearful, when our bodies are worried, our bodies release a hormone called cortisol. And cortisol is called the stress hormone because it gets us ready for fight, flight or freeze. It puts us in that state where we know we need to protect ourselves, and it gets us ready to protect ourselves. Now, what recent research has shown us is that children who are in environments like domestic violence environments, they get a release of this cortisol hormone more often than other children. And what it can do one of two things. It can make them more used to that hormone, so it's less effective, or it can actually make them more prone to looking for danger and being prepared for that risk or that stress or that danger. So their body goes there more quickly, so they're more susceptible to going into that fear response. So there's two different things that can happen, and it very much depends on the child. It's very individual on which happens, or if either happens, to our children who are in domestic violence environments. But for us as parents and carers, it's really important for us to be aware of that our children might go into that fear response more quickly. They might have exposure to cortisol within their body, the stress hormone, more frequently because they're primed for fear. And that can have an impact on them then, and their ability to focus on other things because they're so focused on keeping themselves safe and protecting themselves. Or on the other side of things, you can have a child who has had so much exposure to that actually they seem like they're not bothered at all when difficult things happen within the environment. They might be in an environment where there's lots of screaming and shouting, and they seem to show no reaction at all because they've become so acclimatized to seeing that. So again, there's two different responses we can see there. And then another response then is our child's perception of conflict resolution. And we see this really often in our children who've been exposed to prolonged domestic violence, is that actually they don't know how to resolve conflicts with their friends, with their parents, with others, because they've had so much exposure of examples of how not to resolve conflicts. They might have seen people argue, they might have seen people fight, they might have seen that as soon as there's any type of disagreement, one person starts putting the other person down or blaming them. So they think that's what you do in those situations. What we need to remember is our children are really sponges. They learn from the environment, they soak up everything that they're seeing, and then they can model that and copy that. So what we see from our children who've been exposed to lots of domestic violence is actually that they start copying some of those behaviours, and they don't always know how to resolve conflict, which means that we have to show them a different way to be able to support them with that, because they won't know any different if they've been in that environment. So we can see lots of that inappropriate modelling. The other thing that we can see then is, and we do see this really often with children who've been exposed to lots of domestic violence, is something called hypervigilance. And hypervigilance is where a child is really aware of everything that's going on around them. They're really primed to look for that fear, look for things that can cause them fear all of the time. They're looking for any type of danger. And what that might look like in one of our children is that they might just be sitting quietly, they might be playing, but anybody new enters the room or anybody enters the room, and you can almost see them bristle, and their body language might get quite stiff, and you can visibly see that they might not be looking at the person who's entered, but they're clocking them as soon as they come in, and you might see that they become on high alert. And they're aware of everything that person's doing, and that's hypervigilance. So they're really hypervigilant to anything that's going on around them. They're really looking for any danger because they know that danger could come at any moment. So domestic violence can have this impact on any of our children who've been exposed to domestic violence. And I wanted to give you an example of that. So I'm going to talk about a little boy. I'm going to call him Adam. That's not his real name, but a little boy Adam that we worked with. So when we first started to see him, he was 8 years old and he lived in foster care at that time. But prior to living in foster care, he had lived for all of his life in an environment where his mum and his dad argued a lot. They fought. There was physical fighting, there was shouting, there was lots of swearing at each other, there was lots of blaming each other that was going on between mum and dad. So when I met Adam when he was 8, he was a child who was very hypervigilant, so he would notice as soon as anybody came into any room, and that can be in school, that can be in his foster placement. He'd be watching, he'd be very aware of anybody that came in. He was a very protective little boy, so he had 2 younger siblings and he was extremely protective of them. Very likely that if anybody new came into the room and his siblings were in there, he would be next to his siblings and almost making a barrier between the new person that had come in and his siblings. Because of what he'd experienced at home, he was very wary of his foster carer. He didn't want to trust her at all to begin with. He would try and take on a caring role for his siblings, make sure they were safe. He didn't trust his foster carer to do that. He knew that he had to be there to make sure that they were safe within the home. And it was very difficult to make a relationship with him and to get him to trust. He was very engaging, he was very pleasant, but actually trusting someone enough to accept a cuddle or accept any comfort or accept that person would be able to look after his siblings was really, really difficult for him. And when Adam talked about the violence he'd experienced, what he talked about was needing to protect his siblings. He talked about times when he was in the home with his siblings and violence would start happening between his parents. They might start hitting each other and he would have to get his siblings out of the house as quickly as possible. And he would take them to a neighbour's house or take them to somebody's house where he knew that wouldn't happen until they could return home. But he was on high alert and very hypervigilant and ready to do that immediately. And you can imagine that during those times, that stress hormone cortisol would have been released and he would have been ready to take action. And we talk about fight, flight, or freeze. And for him, it was flight. It was, I'm going to make sure my siblings are safe and we're going to run as far as we can to make sure that we're safe. And that we're not seeing what's going on at home. But despite doing that, he also had a great commitment to his mum. He was very protective of his mum. He wanted to know that she was safe. He wanted to know that she wasn't going to be hurt. He had seen her be hurt in the past. So even though he was in foster care, he was really worried about his mum, and he used to ask about her almost on a daily basis. What do you think mum's doing now? Do you think she's okay? Do you think she's on her own? Do you think she's at home? Do you think my dad's there? So lots of worry going on for him on a daily basis. And then what did that look like sometimes in school? Well, he was very hypervigilant, very much aware of everything that was going on around him. He had great difficulty concentrating, probably because a lot of this was going on in his mind on a day-to-day basis. Is my mum safe? Are my siblings safe? Am I going to be safe? He was a very active little boy. And you can imagine with that cortisol flooding his system all the time, that would have primed him for fight, flight, or freeze. But even at times when he wasn't primed, he was very, very active and always wanted to be busy. He wasn't a child who could just sit and settle very easily. And the change of being in foster care was very, very different for him. It was a calm environment. It was a quiet environment, one where he could sit and have time on his own. But that wasn't comfortable for him, so he didn't do that very often. And at those times, he could be trying to engage with his carers more, and it could come across as quite demanding at times as well, because he wanted their interaction, he wanted to be busy, he wanted to be distracted from some of the things that he'd experienced in the past and likely still thought about now. So as I'm talking, you might be thinking that actually describes the child I'm caring for, it describes my child. What do we do about it? Well, this is really where trauma-informed care comes in. Trauma-informed care starts with understanding the background trauma that a child has experienced. So like Adam, we want to understand what is it that child has seen What is it that has been their daily experience? When we start to understand that, we can start to interpret how that's then impacting on their presentation today, how they interact with the world, how they respond, how we see them on a day-to-day basis. And then we can start to consider how we can support them to repair from that. For many of our children, particularly with domestic violence, it will be providing reassurance that they're safe. And not just reassuring, being really descriptive in this is why you're safe. These are the measures that I've put in place. This is what's going to happen. That descriptive language really does support our children. We then want to help them to calm and be as calm as possible. Some children who've had lots of exposure can have emotional outbursts really, really quickly because they don't know how to control those emotions. They're very used to going into that fight, flight or freeze mode. So we want to help them by co-regulating. We want to help them by giving them lots of examples of how they can calm themselves. And then we want to give them lots of examples of how to resolve conflict because they won't have learned that. So we need to give them lots of examples there as well. And all of this comes into trauma-informed care. Now, I haven't gone into this in detail. It's not possible in this video. I could talk for 10 hours on this topic. But these are the things we need to start thinking of. And it really does start with, what has this individual child experienced? What can I interpret from that? And what can we then consider that they need to help them repair from that trauma that they've experienced? Hopefully that's been helpful. If you'd like to know more about the impact of adverse childhood experiences and what we can do to support our children with trauma-informed care, then subscribe to Tribe for more trauma-informed care in practice.